In a BBC studio last year, George Malcolm chatted to a producer friend about Masterclasses, about the performer's role in creation, and about rubato. First then, Masterclasses, or individual and class teaching.
It seems to be an awful waste of time at colleges and academies for people to have these half-hour, if not sometimes 20-minute lessons once a week by themselves. If that's as much teaching as they can have, which is obviously inadequate, it could at least be done in the form of a class so that lots of other people could be sharing their 20 minutes with them and they could be sharing other people's 20 minutes with them. I think the average pupil surely learns an awful lot by listening to. In fact, I would say that unless a pupil is nervous or has some personal problem, or it's perhaps in the very early stages and is shy or something, that individual lessons behind closed doors, I mean, of which so many seem to be given, should be done away with almost. That a sort of master class should be the norm of tuition in colleges and academies. I don't think that the master class idea would necessarily do away with an occasional private tete-a-tete between the teacher and the pupil. I would think that the normal method of tuition ought to be that of a semi-public class, or that all the pupils of that professor should be free to attend any lesson that he gives. And I concede that if one individual pupil has very idiosyncratic problems of his own, that the teacher might think he's wasting everybody else's time by dealing with them, whereas in fact it may be vital for that particular pupil to have them dealt with. The presence of quite a number of other students, maybe very intelligent and perceptive ones, might have the effect of preventing the teacher from showing off as much as he would do just with one meek pupil in the room. I think with modern students one has to be very careful about showing off. Maybe my point of view is based at any rate partly on a consideration of what actually happens at colleges and academies of music, where to start off with the time each pupil is allotted every week is quite clearly totally inadequate. He has, if he's a first study student, he has 1 hour a week. If his second study is half an hour a week or something absolutely useless. I should have thought that under those conditions it would be to the great benefit of most pupils to sit in on a lot of other people's lessons as well as being the principal pupil for their own half hour.
And now George Malcolm on the performer's role in creation.
One thing that made me think about this question of the contribution of the performer was reading a music critic some years ago who, in relation to some performance, said that the function of the performer is to be the humble servant of the composer. And I simply do not believe this at all. The composer's work has got to be performed, and the performance is the final, definitive state of the composer's work. And it seems to me that artistic collaborations, and some degree of collaboration is obviously necessary, are not made between masters and their humble servants, never have been. I think that the performer's role is one of continuing creation with that of the composer. I suppose as a performer myself, I feel rather violently that enormous though my admiration is for Bach, I mean unlimited though my admiration is for Bach, I don't feel like his humble servant when I'm playing his music. I feel like a collaborator in the job. I was giving a recital at the summer school at Dartington once in which I played the C minor fugue from the 48. Well, on that particular evening I was feeling in a very legato cantabile mood, and I played and it seemed to work beautifully. And after the recital, a young Polish lady student came up to me, and she said she had been extremely interested in my performance of this fugue, and in fact she liked it very much. But she had always been taught that it should be played staccato, or at any rate detached. Had I got any sort of historical justification for playing it the other way? So I said, well, naturally there are no indications in the notes that Bach left of doing it either way. So she said no, she quite understood that. So I said, but in fact, until this evening, I have always done it detached. But this evening, I was feeling like doing it the other way, and I did it the other way, and it seemed to me that it came off. And I have never seen anybody look quite so shocked as that girl. She said, but this is Bach. Now, she would have been prepared to accept the word of one professor that it should be staccato, or she would have been prepared to respect the word of another professor, perhaps myself, who could have argued on musical grounds that it ought to be legato. She could even have accepted the situation of one authority arguing with another on principle about it. But the fact that a performer could just use the mood of the moment struck her as the most shocking thing she'd ever known. And it seems to me that that point of view, though perhaps not so common now in Western Europe, is one which has existed and which I react against very, very strongly. Creative collaboration, of course, in a lot of 18th century music is required in the nature of the music, particularly in the realization of continuo parts. But I think the thing really goes further than that. In fact, I sometimes wonder whether music, as written by a composer on paper, is capable of being finally classified into good or bad. So much does the performer have to do with it. And just as Schubert or Mozart could set fifth-rate verbal texts to music and make great works of art out of them, I think that periodically a performer can take what appears on paper to be a third-rate work of art and, I mean, quite literally transform it into a great work of art. I'm not even sure that I always think the composer has seen through his own work. I'm willing to admit the possibility of there being aspects of a composer's work which he hasn't even seen through himself and which can be brought out and enhanced by the performer. I rather tend to oppose the idea of composers who think that they've done the whole job when they've got it down on paper and have put in expression marks and signs in every bar, and that that's how it goes. I expect there is music which is complete in that form, but an immense amount of music isn't. I would like it generally understood that composers may be wrong. This seems to be heresy these days. The composer is right, and it's the performer who's wrong, and I don't think this is necessarily always the case. Sometimes even with very great composers. I know an extremely able young composer called David Lord, and if I'm sight reading through a piece of his and actually play a wrong note by mistake, he almost invariably says, "Oh, that sounds much nicer, let's change it."
And finally, George Malcolm on rubato.
I grew up under the impression that in 18th century music, in Bach, for example, rubato was absolutely forbidden. It's very interesting how musicological fashions change, because in those days, any sort of metrical or rhythmic rubato was absolutely frowned upon. I mean, one might be allowed a tiny ritardando in the last bar, but apart from that, one kept the metronome going throughout. On the other hand, dynamic variations were almost mandatory. I mean, you were encouraged to do as many crescendi and diminuendi as you liked. Now, of course, you mustn't do crescendi and diminuendi at all, but you are allowed, in the modern fashion, and quite correctly, as I believe, a little bit more flexibility in the matter of rhythm and perhaps slight changes of tempo. I believe that 18th century music was probably played with a great deal of rubato. And I'm certain that early 19th century music was. One of the critics the other day said that Beethoven, considered as a Beethoven player, would probably be hissed off the platform these days, and I'm quite certain that would be the reason. I don't know quite how this idea grew up, that pre-classical music was to be played without any rubato at all. Even if it were true that Baroque music, for example, is less emotional, and I suppose it is less personally and individually emotional than Romantic music, I treat rubato very much as being a question of elegant style, as much as having a necessarily emotional content. The more I play this music, the more I am tempted to employ types of rubato which not only would have been frowned on when I was a student, but which I think I would have frowned on then and found extremely distasteful.
George Malcolm, chatting in a studio.